Now, those of you who know me will know that I have an interest in the 17th century in Ulster history, and in particular the period associated with the plantation of Ulster and the movements of peoples, particularly from Scotland, into the north of Ireland during that era. What was great this morning was to hear Moore Sinnerton reminding us very strongly that although this early 17th century is important, the biggest migration of all took place in the last decade of that 17th century, and much of it was fuelled by severe famine conditions in Scotland. So in other words, we've got tens of thousands of Scots crossing the north, many of them coming here with little more than the clothes on their back. And we are, to a greater or less extent, the children of that migration, as well as earlier migrations. And in my own family history, I'm very conscious that in the latter part of the 16th century, one of my ancestors crossed into the province of Ulster. I stand before you, a lineal descendant of a Highland warrior, a Redshank. Now, I know you'll find that hard to believe, but it's true. My ancestor, a McKean or a McCain, from the glacier of Kilmichael in Argyllshire, moved here in the late 1500s as a mercenary soldier. He would have been a Gaelic speaker, a Catholic, and what would give him worth in the world was his ability to kill. That is part of my ancestry. You know, I can't do anything about it, but that is the reality. He came here in the late 16th century to fight as a mercenary, probably for one of the O'Donnell lords in northwest Ulster. And that migration of Redshanks is another aspect of history that hasn't fully been explored. What was the impact of that? When you take, for example, 1598, there's a report that there were 60 to 80 Scottish families living in Strabane in County Tyrone. Maybe 400 Scots living in Strabane at the end of the 1500s, before the plantation. Okay, this is before the plantation. And there is a danger of concentrating too much on that early 17th century at the expense of other periods. And we've heard Aidan McPullen this morning talk about the much earlier story of the interaction between Scotland and Ulster. And what I'd like to do very briefly is to look at a particular event that took place in the early 14th century that is certainly worth bearing in mind and considering in the overall study of Scotland and Ulster. We all love anniversaries, and at the moment we're trying to grapple with the events of 100 years ago and the best way in which we should commemorate those. Well, just the last week in the news there was an announcement about how the 700th anniversary of the Battle of Bannockburn, and Billy has mentioned it already, will be marked this summer with a large-scale reenactment. More than 300 warriors will perform in scenes choreographed by the team behind the battle sequences in the hit films Gladiator and Robin Hood. And this will take part as part of the Bannockburn Live Festival that will be held at the end of June this year. So 700 years since the Battle of Bannockburn. Now next year, we will have our own 700th anniversary that will be taking place. And that is the arrival of a very large Scottish army in County Antrim, commanded by the younger brother of Robert the Bruce, Edward Bruce. I just want to take a few moments just to talk about that. In terms of the importance of the story, here's a quote from James Lydon, who's he died recently, but one of the preeminent historians of medieval Ireland. In the history of the English lordship of Ireland in the Middle Ages, there is no single event more important than the invasion by Edward Bruce in 1315. It was also an event of the greatest importance in Iberno-Scottish relations. So historians both in Scotland and Ireland regard this as being something of huge importance. This has been regarded as part of a grand Gaelic alliance against the Anglo-Normans, linking the Scots, the Welsh and the Irish. Now, here's a fascinating letter. It may have been written just on the eve of the Scottish invasion. It may have been written some years before, but this is what Robert the Bruce writes to Donald O'Neill, the King of Tyrone. We and you and our people and your people share the same national ancestry. and are urged to come together more eagerly, so that with God's will, your nation may be able to recover her ancient liberty. Okay, so you can see the overtures from Robert the Bruce to the Irish Lords. Now, in May 1315, 6,000 men, many of them veterans of Bannockburn, assemble at Ayr, set sail in a flotilla of boats, and arrive on the east coast of County Antrim. It's worth making the point the army was reckoned to be 6,000 strong. Now, the Scottish army at Bannockburn is reckoned to have been about 6,000 to 7,000. Okay? So you're talking about a comparable force to the Scottish army that took part in the Battle of Bannockburn. So the fleet set sails at the end of May and arrives on the east coast of County Antrim. Larne is frequently given as the traditional landing place. With a force that size, it's likely they landed at a number of places along the East Antrim coast. When we talk about remembering the past and how there was maybe a greater consciousness of it a century ago than there is today, this is from the manual or brochure for the Larne Grand Fete and Fancy Fair of 1899. And on the front cover, there's an imagining of the arrival of Bruce's army at Larne. At that time, nearly 600 years before. So there's clearly an interest in the story for it to be featured so prominently on the front cover of this book. So then, the first major event in terms of the Bruce story, and in particular in Ireland, but in particular Ulster, is the landing on the east coast of County Antrim. Now, Edward Bruce came here to be crowned King of Ireland. And here we have, from Thomas Davis's Hints for Irish Historical Paintings, an imagining of the coronation of Edward Bruce. The interesting thing is that Davis was very much involved in the nationalist movement in Ireland. He came up with 72 suggestions for what should be commemorated through paintings in Ireland, and he chose the coronation of Edward Bruce. Strange as it might seem, Bruce was actually regarded as something of a hero by many nationalists in 19th century Ireland. But it's also interesting in terms of the consciousness. Last year, Mark Thompson, John Edmund and I were doing some work in this story, the Magus project, to look into the potential that there is to commemorate the story of the Bruces in Ireland, and what tourism opportunities might arise from it, what events could be carried out. My mother asked me, what were you working on at the moment? I said, well, I'm doing something on the story of Edward Bruce and Ireland. She says, oh yes, Edward Bruce was crowned King of Ireland. I said, well, how did you know that? And she was, I was taught that at school. Okay, I wasn't taught that at school. Like Mark Thompson, I studied Nazi Germany and the Arab-Israeli conflict. My mother, who was from Donegal, Irish was her second language, had actually learned the story of Edward Bruce while she was at school. Certainly wasn't taught here. Now, the traditional account of Bruce's coronation is that it took place at Dundalk. In actual fact, more recently, historians have suggested that it took place here, at Carrickfergus, very soon after his arrival. They arrive in May, march to Carrickfergus, they capture the town. They don't initially capture the castle, but it's probably in June 1315 that Edward Bruce, with the O'Neills and their vassals and allies in attendance, is crowned King of Ireland. That's the second major event, the coronation of Edward Bruce. Now then we have a long campaign that takes place over a period of around about 3.5 years. But in terms of the 1315 story, and in particular the story of Ulster, the next major event is the Battle of Faughart, which takes place on the 10th of September 1315. So you can see, for example, some of the sites associated with Edward Bruce and his army in the northern half of Ireland. And so you can see where the line comes down and goes up and then stops at the Battle of Faughart. The Battle of Faughart was arguably the most important battle in Ulster in the medieval period. It was a major confrontation between the forces of Edward Bruce and some of his Irish allies, and the forces of the Anglo-Normans, led by Richard de Burgh, Earl of Ulster, and some of his Irish allies, and resulted in a resounding victory for Bruce and his men. And at the end of September, by September 1315, Edward Bruce was the effective master of Ulster. Okay, I know he was crowned King of Ireland, and the campaign certainly continued on after that, reaching down even as far as Limerick and Clare. But as far as the northern part of the story, we got three key events within a few months in late spring, early autumn 1315, which are certainly worth thinking about in the overall context of the relationship between Scotland and Ireland. Now, Edward Bruce met his fate at the Battle of Faughart on the 14th of October 1318, a resounding defeat for his army, after which what's left of the Scottish army returns to Scotland. Not, of course, the end of the story between Scotland and Ireland in that period. Robert the Bruce continues to visit Ireland on a number of occasions after this, so there's still a continuing relationship. But certainly, as far as the Bruce campaign ends in 1318. You can see here at Faughart, in the old graveyard, a ledger stone repeatedly marking the spot where he is supposed to have been buried, although given that his body was butchered, quite how much of him is actually left under that stone is doubtful. A number of years ago, just in the last 2 or 3 years ago I think, another plaque was erected at the side of the grave in Irish and in English, telling us Edward Bruce, King of Ireland, killed in the Battle of Faughart, 14th October 1318. Again, why is a story important, or why should we even be thinking about it? Well, first of all, it gives us another perspective on the story between Ulster and Scotland. The fixation of events of either 100 years ago or 400 years ago are often used to cement and justify Northern Ireland's present-day tensions of identity. And yet here we have a story which introduces to a modern consciousness events that predate by hundreds of years the starting point for the common Ulster-Scots narrative, and also it reinforces the length of those links going back much further than simply the 17th century. It also provides an opportunity to explore Ulster's medieval inheritance. There are a number of great sites associated with the Bruce campaign. Here, for example, is Greencastle in County Down. Fantastic site, Anglo-Norman castle, captured by the Bruces, I think 1316. Fantastic views over Carlingford Loch, a wonderful place to learn more about our past. And again, just to reinforce the point, Sean Duffy would now be the preeminent Irish historian of the medieval period. Reflect on those connections, reflect on a different perspective on those connections, and next year could be a very interesting year. So thank you very much for listening.